It started as just another fiery Senate hearing, until Congressman Adam Schiff dropped a bombshell insult, calling Senator John Kennedy a thug on a live mic. What happened next? No one saw it coming. In a matter of seconds, the entire room turned silent, as Kennedy leaned in and responded with something so sharp, so unexpected, that even Schiff's expression changed. But that was just the beginning. By the end of this story, you'll witness a stunning twist that left the whole committee and millions watching absolutely speechless. Stay with us. What's coming will shock you. It happened live on the floor of the Senate Judiciary Committee, broadcast to millions, yet no one could have predicted how quickly things would spiral. The session was supposed to be routine, a bipartisan debate over proposed amendments to a controversial domestic surveillance bill. Voices had been raised, sure, but that was normal. These were high-stakes conversations with high-profile players. Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana, known for his plain-spoken grit and folksy but razor-sharp commentary, had just taken the mic. His tone, calm but direct, cut through the noise. He leaned into the microphone and asked a pointed question to a witness, challenging the legal foundation behind expanded surveillance powers. Across the aisle, Representative Adam Schiff, invited to speak in support of the bill, didn't wait for the witness to respond. He jumped in sharply, voice rising, visibly irritated by Kennedy's questioning. "Enough with the theatrics," Schiff said. "This isn't a courtroom drama. You're not cross-examining a criminal, Senator. You're acting like a thug." Time stopped. The word dropped into the chamber like a grenade. The other senators froze. Staffers looked up from their notes. Reporters in the press gallery paused, pens in midair. The cameras kept rolling. No one could believe what they'd just heard. Senator Kennedy didn't move at first. His hand, resting on the table, stayed still. His eyes narrowed, slowly turning towards Schiff. "Say that again?" he said, not out of rage but disbelief. Schiff didn't backpedal. He just shifted in his seat and repeated it, slower this time. "You're bullying witnesses. That's not oversight. That's thuggery." There was no outburst. There was no shouting match. But the tension was thick, electric. Kennedy leaned back in his chair, exhaled, and for a moment, just a moment, looked genuinely pained. Not insulted, not politically offended, but humanly hurt. "You know what, Congressman," he said slowly, "I've been called a lot of things, but I've never been called that. Not on the record, not in this building, and certainly not by someone who claims to stand for justice." He paused, voice steady, but eyes heavy with something deeper. "I'm not angry. I'm just disappointed that someone would look at me, at my life, my work, my history, and toss that word around like it's just political seasoning." People expected him to fire back with snark or sarcasm, but that's not what came. Instead, Kennedy lowered his eyes briefly, and then looked straight at Schiff. "You have no idea what that word means to someone who's seen real violence, real intimidation. You have no idea what that word meant to the people I grew up with, the people who didn't have power, the people who got run down by the ones who did." Silence again. Schiff shifted in his seat, unsure of what to say. Kennedy didn't wait for him to speak. "I don't bully people. I don't grandstand. I ask hard questions because I believe the American people deserve real answers. That's not thuggery. That's duty." He leaned forward now, both hands on the table, his voice still calm, but his words cut deep. "You want to throw around labels? Fine. But just know, when you speak that word, you speak to every kid who got called that in a school hallway just for being different. You speak to every man who worked his whole life just to be told by someone in a nicer suit that he doesn't belong." One of the reporters watching from above whispered, "He's not defending himself. He's defending everyone." And he was. By the end of the exchange, there was no applause. No one dared, because everyone in that room knew. They had just witnessed the start of something bigger than a petty exchange. They saw the crack in the political mask, a moment where one man didn't take the bait, but laid his soul on the table instead. And Adam Schiff? He looked like he'd swallowed something bitter, because for all his words in that moment, he knew. He had made a mistake. He had tried to wound a man with language, but he ended up revealing something about himself instead. And America was watching. The silence that followed felt like it stretched forever. Senator Kennedy didn't rush. He didn't try to reclaim control of the room. Instead, he stared at the table for a moment, as if weighing whether it was worth saying what was truly on his mind. Then he looked up, not at Adam Schiff, but straight ahead, as if speaking to the American people themselves. "You know," he began, "when I was 13 years old, I saw something no kid should have to see." The chamber remained dead quiet. It was late, around 10 o'clock. My older brother Jacob had picked me up from the library. We didn't have much growing up in Zachary, Louisiana, but we had books. He always made sure I kept reading. He said, "John, even if we can't afford college, nobody can take knowledge from you." A slight tremor crept into his voice, the first crack in his otherwise polished presence. That night we stopped at a gas station. Just two brothers sharing a soda, talking about a girl he liked, and a science fair project I was struggling with. We didn't see the car pull in behind us. Kennedy paused, blinked once, took a slow breath. Three men jumped out. They thought Jacob had money on him. He didn't, but it didn't matter. They slammed him to the ground. I screamed. I tried to pull one of them off him, and I got punched so hard I chipped 2 teeth. A hush came over even the press box. They beat him within an inch of his life. He never walked the same again, never spoke the same again. The doctors said the brain swelling was irreversible. He couldn't finish high school. He never held a steady job after that. Kennedy swallowed hard. "So when you call me a thug, Congressman, I don't hear politics. I hear them. I see them. And I remember the way they laughed when they drove off and left him there like trash." Schiff didn't interrupt. Couldn't. His face had shifted from frustration to something else, something bordering on shame. "My dad was a mechanic," Kennedy continued, his voice regaining strength. "Worked 16 hours a day just to keep the lights on. My mom waited tables on the night shift. We didn't have lawyers. We didn't have health insurance. We had grit and we had prayer." He looked around the chamber now. "I got where I am because I didn't have a choice but to work, fight, and claw for every inch. I put myself through law school selling bait out of a tackle shop. Do you know how many people laughed at that? Called me a redneck? Said I'd never make it to Capitol Hill?" Kennedy didn't smile. He didn't need to. His point hung in the air like a weight on every chest. "But I did make it, and I didn't do it by intimidating people. I did it by believing the Constitution still meant something, that we're all equal under the law, that every man, no matter how poor, no matter how forgotten, deserves the dignity of being heard." He turned his eyes slowly back to Schiff. "You don't have to like my style. Lord knows I don't expect a standing ovation. But don't you ever confuse conviction with cruelty? And don't you dare call me what those men were, those who beat my brother half to death and walked away without a single charge." The chamber felt stiller than ever. Schiff's jaw was tight now, but his expression had softened. This wasn't a game anymore. This wasn't partisan sparring. Something raw had been let out into the open, something that demanded more than a rebuttal. Kennedy reached for his glass of water and took a slow sip before setting it down again. "I have scars I don't show, wounds time never fully healed, but I carry them, and I remember why I'm here. Not to win arguments, but to protect people who can't sit in this chair. That's what keeps me going. That's what keeps me. Another beat of silence passed before he spoke again. "You may not respect me, but you will respect the lives of the people I come from." He said nothing more, but in that moment, nothing else needed to be said. Adam Schiff looked stunned, not by anger, not even by political defeat, but by the sheer weight of what Senator Kennedy had just laid bare. His eyes flickered, searching the room as if looking for some stable ground, some ready-made response. But nothing came. The room was still too quiet. Even seasoned senators who had sat through decades of debates and mudslinging didn't move a muscle. A few stared at the floor. Others just watched Kennedy, who sat perfectly still, his hands folded, his shoulders square, his face calm but deeply worn. Schiff shifted in his chair. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Senator Kennedy," he began, his voice low, almost unsure, "I didn't mean your past. I wasn't referring to that. I Kennedy raised a hand gently, not to silence him, but to pause him. He didn't look offended. He looked tired. "You meant what you said," he replied quietly. "You just didn't know what it meant." That line landed heavier than anything so far. Schiff blinked slowly, visibly processing it. It wasn't a deflection. It was a quiet truth, and it hung in the air like smoke. "I don't need an apology," Kennedy continued, voice still steady. "I don't even need you to like me. But I do need you, and everyone watching this, to understand that words like that carry real weight. Not just political weight, human weight." He leaned forward slightly now, not to grandstand, but to be heard more clearly. "You're a prosecutor. You've spent your career choosing your words with precision. So when you call someone a thug, on record in front of the nation, you're not just making a point. You're branding them. And once you brand someone, the country listens." A murmur rose from the press gallery. It wasn't noise. It was impact, realization, resonance. Kennedy's voice dropped lower. "My entire life, I've been working to prove that where I came from doesn't define what I can become. That people like me, who weren't born into power, who weren't polished by prep schools, still belong here, still deserve to shape this country's future." He turned his gaze back to Schiff, softer now but direct. "I'm not a thug. I'm a public servant. I get up every day, put on this tie, and walk into this building not to intimidate, but to ask the hard questions, to fight for the people who never got their brother back." Schiff said nothing, and that silence, it said everything. The air felt heavier now. The room wasn't just full of lawmakers anymore. It was full of stories, of pasts, of scars rarely talked about. And one man, just one, had laid him out, not to win an argument, but to remind everyone listening what it costs to judge someone you don't know. Then something happened that rarely happens in the halls of American politics. Someone at the far end of the committee table, a junior senator who rarely spoke, whispered just loud enough to be heard, "He's right." And Schiff? He finally looked down, not at notes, not at a device, but at his own hands. "I was out of line," he said softly, the words heavy. "And I'm sorry, John." Kennedy didn't respond. Not with words. He just gave the slightest nod. Not as a victory, but as a release. Then he turned, not towards Schiff, but back to the room, to the witnesses, to the cameras, to the people. "We can't keep doing this," he said quietly. "We can't keep turning disagreement into dehumanization. Because if we do, it's not just our politics that suffer, it's our people. All of them. Every single one." And with that, he leaned back in his chair again. No fist-pounding. No self-congratulation. Just a man who had come into the chamber to do his job and ended up reminding the country what decency looks like when it stands its ground. No one interrupted him again. For a few moments after Senator Kennedy finished speaking, the entire room stayed still. No one dared break the silence, not even the chairperson. What had started as a tense, standard political back and forth had transformed into something else entirely. Something few expected from a government hearing. A moment of shared humanity. And then, unexpectedly, someone at the edge of the chamber did something no one was prepared for. They clapped. Just once. The sound of a single hand striking palm echoed awkwardly at first. But then came a second, then a third. And before anyone could stop themselves, the room was slowly filled with a reluctant, uncertain, yet deeply respectful applause. Not political, not partisan, just human. The kind of applause reserved for a truth that hits home harder than anyone expected. A few staffers blinked back emotion they weren't prepared to feel at work. Even some of the most hardened senators, those who normally prided themselves on never showing weakness, sat quietly, some nodding. Some were unable to look directly at Kennedy, as if unsure they deserved to. Adam Schiff didn't applaud, but he did something that, at that moment, said more. He lowered his head. Not out of shame alone, but reflection, regret, and maybe a dawning awareness that he had crossed a line that couldn't simply be repaired with words. No cameras were flashing now. Reporters weren't rushing to tweet every sentence. Everyone just watched Kennedy, because what he said had pulled something personal out of the room. It wasn't about surveillance bills anymore. It wasn't about party lines or political grandstanding. It was about memory, pain, and the dangerous ease with which people in power sometimes forget that the people across from them are not just opponents, but human beings. And then Kennedy spoke again. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with a stillness that demanded listening. "I don't tell that story for sympathy," he said. "I tell it because there are millions of people in this country who live it in silence, who carry invisible weight every day while folks in this building talk over their pain." He looked not at Schiff now, but at everyone. Witnesses, colleagues, the press, the country. "We are broken in ways we rarely admit, but we don't fix broken things by breaking each other more. We fix them by listening, not just to words, but to what lives behind the words." You could have heard a pin drop. Schiff raised his head now, slowly. He looked directly at Kennedy. Not defiant, not defensive, but different. "I've served a long time," he said, voice rough. "But today I learned more in 5 minutes from you than I have from 100 debates." The words weren't rehearsed, and they weren't enough to undo what had been said. But in that moment they mattered. One by one, senators who rarely agreed on anything began to nod. Not at Schiff, but at Kennedy. A few even whispered to their aides. Not policy changes, not strategy shifts, just, "That was real." Outside the chamber, something strange began to happen. Clips of the moment had already begun making their way online. Uncut, unedited, raw. And viewers were reacting not as political tribes, but as people. Messages poured in. "I was crying in my car listening to this. I've never liked Kennedy, but what he said, that was something else. I've been called a thug. My dad, too. We felt that. I wish every senator talked like that." On Twitter, hashtags began to trend. Not just Kennedy's name, but things like, "well have scars," and "Xuri, listen first." A shift had begun. Not a revolution, not a miracle, but a rare flicker of unity in a place that often feels like it thrives on division. A brief, shining moment where the country remembered that the men and women behind the microphones weren't just lawmakers. They were sons, daughters, brothers, people who hurt, people who remember. And in that flicker of time, John Kennedy wasn't just a senator from Louisiana. He was a voice for every bruised soul who'd ever been misjudged, every working American who carried their pain quietly, every family whose story never made the floor, but whose strength was the backbone of the country. And whether Schiff liked it or not, whether anyone liked it or not, he had given Kennedy the spark. The insult had been the match, but the fire, that came from something far deeper, something no one could stop watching. The hearing eventually resumed, but it was never the same. People spoke again. Yes, legal points were made, evidence discussed, and statements entered into the record. But the energy had changed. No one raised their voice. No one interrupted. Even the most aggressive voices in the room now spoke with a tone of quiet reflection, as if afraid to shatter the fragile sense of gravity that Senator Kennedy's story had created. Kennedy himself didn't speak again. He sat, listening, his face composed, but his eyes distant, like a man who had released something he'd carried for too long. He didn't need to add more. What he'd said lived in the room now. It lived in silence between every sentence. Adam Schiff stayed too. He didn't storm out or try to reclaim the narrative. He didn't spin the moment for the press. He just remained there, notebook in hand, scribbling quietly, head low. A man changed, not defeated, but humbled. Outside the Senate chamber, something even more unexpected began happening. A group of veterans waiting in the hallway, unrelated to the hearing, stopped Kennedy as he walked out. "Sir," one of them said, his voice steady but hoarse, "I just wanted to thank you for saying what a lot of us feel but never had the chance to say." Another man, older, in his 60s, with thick calloused hands, grabbed Kennedy's hand and shook it hard. "My brother died because no one listened to him. Today, you spoke for him too." Kennedy didn't offer a campaign line or brush them off politely. He just looked each of them in the eye, nodded and said, "That means more to me than you know." By the time he stepped outside into the sunlight, reporters swarmed him, expecting fire. expecting him to use the moment to launch a full-blown political attack. But he didn't. "I'm not here to win points," Kennedy said, standing on the steps. "I'm here to do right. Sometimes that means calling things out. Sometimes it means shutting up and listening. Today, I hope we all learn something about both." One of the younger journalists, likely new to Capitol Hill, called out, "Senator, do you forgive Congressman Schiff?" Kennedy looked directly into the cameras. "It ain't about forgiveness," he said. "It's about growth. I don't hold grudges, but I do hold memories. And if today made any of us better at understanding each other, then maybe something good came out of something painful." It wasn't the kind of soundbite people were used to. It wasn't red meat. It wasn't viral outrage. It was something better. Truth. That evening, every major news outlet ran the clip, not because it was explosive, but because it was impossible to look away from. Kennedy's words were played on every channel, on the radio and social media, and not just by the networks that typically praised him, all of them. Editorials ran from both left and right-leaning publications, all acknowledging the same thing. Something real had broken through the political noise. On TikTok, a young man uploaded a tearful reaction video. "My dad was called a thug when he protested peacefully," he said, choking up. "I never thought I'd see someone in Congress say what that word means. Thank you, Senator Kennedy." In a homeless shelter in Ohio, a volunteer played the clip during dinner. A few men around the table stopped eating, tears welling. "He's one of us," someone whispered. In a school auditorium in Alabama, a teacher paused her civics lesson to play it. Afterward, a student asked, "Why don't more politicians talk like that?" And back in Washington, Adam Schiff, alone in his office, the hearing long over, sat at his desk staring at a piece of paper. He had written 6 words on it. "He reminded me why I started." No one saw it. No one needed to, because the impact had already happened. The insult that was supposed to be a political zinger had turned into a national reckoning, and John Kennedy, without intending to, had reminded America of something we're so quick to forget: that behind every argument is a person, that pain has a voice, and that sometimes the loudest statement isn't made by shouting at all. It's made by simply telling the truth, unflinching, unpolished, and from the heart. And that's why millions watched to the very end, because they didn't just see a senator stand his ground. They saw a man stand up for everyone who's ever been knocked down. Days passed, but the moment refused to fade. Clips of Senator Kennedy's emotional exchange had traveled far beyond political circles. It had reached dining tables, high school classrooms, union halls, prayer groups, and even prison cells. It sparked uncomfortable conversations in some places and quiet healing in others. But what mattered most wasn't just how far it reached, it was how deeply it touched people. And in that time, something began to shift. Not dramatically, not instantly, but undeniably. Senator John Kennedy, often known for his sharp wit and blunt political takes, was now being seen in a new light. Not just as a politician, but as a man who bled when cut, who didn't mask his scars behind party lines, and who refused to let a moment of cruelty pass without truth. One morning, a letter arrived at his office. It wasn't from a donor. It wasn't even from a constituent. It was from Adam Schiff, handwritten, 3 pages. In it, Schiff detailed his early years, growing up the son of a salesman, struggling to find footing in law school, and feeling invisible in the early days of Congress. He admitted something most politicians never would. "Somewhere along the way, I got good at winning arguments and bad at understanding people. That day, I saw something in you that I'd lost in myself." He didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply said, "Thank you." Kennedy read the letter slowly, quietly, then folded it once and slid it into the top drawer of his desk without a word. That same afternoon, he went back to the chamber. The topic on the table was a bill about veterans' mental health, something Kennedy had championed for years, but never quite gotten enough traction for. Normally, this was the kind of legislation that stalled, caught up in partisan gridlock and budget debates. But something was different now. When he stood up to speak, no one looked at their phones. No one whispered to their aides. Everyone listened. And when he finished, the room applauded, not with thunder, but with unity. Schiff himself stood up, and with him, others from both sides of the aisle. The bill passed through committee unanimously, and that small ripple, the kind of ripple politics rarely sees anymore, kept spreading. The next week, a high school debate team from rural Kentucky sent Kennedy a video message. One by one, students explained how his words changed how they approached disagreement. One girl said, "I always thought strength meant proving you're right. Now I think it means standing for what's right, even when it hurts." In Baton Rouge, a group of factory workers pooled funds to buy a billboard. It read simply, "You spoke for us. Thank you, Senator Kennedy." But perhaps the most moving moment came at a town hall meeting in his home state. A woman stood up, clearly nervous, mid-40s, two kids beside her. She clutched a folder of papers, medical records most likely, but didn't look down at them. "My husband was called a thug in front of our kids during a traffic stop," she said, her voice shaking. "He wasn't perfect, but he didn't deserve that, and neither do they." She turned to Kennedy, tears in her eyes. "When you spoke that day, I felt like someone finally said out loud what we've all been feeling. You didn't just talk, you stood up." Kennedy nodded, holding her gaze. "It's long past time more of us did." And with that, something solidified, not in headlines, not in sound bites, but in hearts. This story hadn't been about an insult. It had been about a mirror, one held up to the nation, forcing people to see not just each other, but themselves, their anger, their assumptions, their wounds. And through that mirror, they didn't see a perfect country. They didn't see perfect politicians. They saw a reminder that the people in Washington are still people, that dignity matters, that stories matter, and that sometimes the most powerful moment in politics isn't when someone wins. It's when someone tells the truth and lets the silence speak for itself. That's how one word, one careless insult, became a national turning point. Not because it was said, but because someone dared to respond with humanity instead of hate. That's how Senator John Kennedy didn't just defend his name. He defended the names of millions of Americans like him, and made one of the most unforgettable political moments in recent memory, one that didn't divide, but finally, quietly, began to heal. Weeks passed. What had begun as a fiery, almost routine exchange in a Senate hearing now lived on, not in the headlines, but in the quiet spaces between them. In the weeks following the moment when Senator John Kennedy turned an insult into a national wake-up call, a different kind of change began unfolding. One that wasn't declared with banners or hashtags, one that grew slowly, like roots beneath a cracked sidewalk. For Kennedy, life moved on, but not as it had before. He kept showing up to the Senate chamber with the same folders under his arm, the same drawl in his voice, the same grit in his walk. But people saw him differently now, not just as a policy hawk or a Southern firebrand. They saw someone who had dropped the armor for a moment and let the country see something raw, something human. In D.C., other lawmakers began referencing that hearing not for its political content, but for its emotional truth. "Let's not forget what Senator Kennedy reminded us of," one Democrat said during a tense budget debate, "that behind every policy we fight over are people who live with the consequences." You could tell some were trying, finally, to speak not just to win, but to connect. One afternoon, Kennedy was invited to speak at a bipartisan retreat, something he'd usually brush off. But this time, he said yes. Standing before a room of lawmakers from both parties, Kennedy didn't come with notes. He didn't open with a joke. He just said, "We spend so much time trying to look strong that we forget how powerful it is to just be honest." Then he paused. "This place taught me how to fight, but life taught me what's worth fighting for. And it ain't just re-elections or one-upping each other. It's dignity. For ourselves, for our families, for the folks back home who can't afford to sit in rooms like this." The room didn't cheer. They didn't need to. They just listened. And when it ended, even those who'd once rolled their eyes at Kennedy crossed the floor, shook his hand, and said simply, "Thank you." But the story didn't stop in Washington. Far from it. A small nonprofit in Alabama named Dignity First began using Kennedy's speech to train volunteers working with marginalized youth. In a single weekend, their video of his testimony crossed 10 million views. Churches began using his words in sermons, not for political gain, but to teach compassion. Even in college classrooms, where Kennedy hadn't always been popular among students, professors began assigning his speech as reading material for courses on rhetoric, leadership, and ethics. One professor at NYU titled his lecture, "When Truth Outweighs Partisanship." The biggest surprise came when Adam Schiff, without fanfare or press, quietly introduced a co-sponsored amendment with Kennedy himself. The bill, a bipartisan effort to increase funding for trauma-informed counseling in low-income schools. Schiff didn't take credit. Neither did Kennedy. They just signed it and let the work speak louder than the words. Back home in Louisiana, Kennedy held a town hall where he expected the usual crowd: loyal constituents, maybe a few hecklers, reporters fishing for sound bites. But that night, something different happened. A young man, barely 19, took the mic. "I grew up thinking politics was a game," he said. "Like y'all just argued to get on TV. But when you told that story, Senator, it hit me. I realized maybe this stuff matters. Maybe we matter." Kennedy's voice caught slightly when he answered. "You do," he said. "Don't let anyone tell you different." That moment would later be quoted in a high school graduation speech. By then, Kennedy had unknowingly done something very few politicians ever achieve. He had transcended politics, not by running from it, but by returning to what it's supposed to be: service. Service that listens. Service that remembers. Service that doesn't need applause to know it's doing the right thing. And that's when the story came full circle. One night after a long day in session, Kennedy returned to his office to find a letter sitting on his desk. No postage, no return address, just a note. The handwriting was careful, almost too neat. It read, "You don't know me, but I'm the son of a man who was once called what you were called that day." He gave up. I almost did too. Then I watched you speak. I listened. I cried. And for the first time, I didn't feel invisible. Thank you for showing the world we're not thugs. We're sons, we're fathers, we're Americans. Kennedy read the letter twice. Then he folded it gently and slid it into the same drawer where Schiff's apology still sat. Not a trophy, not a souvenir, a reminder. Those words have weight. That pain can be power. And that, sometimes, in the halls of Congress, the most radical thing you can do is to be human. And that's what millions watched unfold. Not a fight, not a takedown, not a viral clip designed to stoke rage. They saw the story of a man who turned hurt into hope, who reminded a bitterly divided nation that even in its most broken moments, dignity still matters. And that's why, long after the cameras stopped rolling, the echo of that moment still lives on. Not just in history, but in hearts.